Hello, good morning, good afternoon to our audience joining us from various time zones. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. Today's program is titled With Renewed Efforts to End the War, What Are the Prospects for Peace in Yemen? And it's part of our ongoing coverage of the conflict and possible pathways to sustainable peace in Yemen.
Thank you so much, Raymond, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. I think it's going to be a great conversation today. Obviously, the last few months have been very, very active within Yemen. So just to set the stage before our panelists present their talks, just a bit of a reminder, on the last full day that the Trump administration was in office, they designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. That was on January 19th of this year. Immediately after that, the Biden administration came in. The Biden administration on February 4th appointed a new U.S. special envoy for Yemen. Later that month, the Biden administration revoked the foreign terrorist organization designation on the Houthis. We saw after that an almost immediate renewed offensive of the Houthis toward the city, toward Marib in sort of central and eastern Yemen. And so the question that we're going to talk about today is peace possible in Yemen? What does a peace look like? What's the current situation on the ground? And I think we have three fascinating speakers who are going to give us their insights. So we're going to start with Fatima, and I'll turn it over to her now, and we'll let her speak and present her thoughts.
Thank you so much, Greg. And I would like also to thank Raymond for putting together this panel, and the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington for having us on this very timely topic today. Also truly honored to be alongside distinguished colleagues, Rasha and Ibrahim. We're all originally from Yemen, and Yemen is really close to our hearts. And it means a lot to be able to talk about it with the policy community and people who are generally interested in Yemen. So as we talk about peace in Yemen, I want to just say that this is one of the areas that is of interest to me is the social contract making. And I've studied several peace processes and the social contract spheres in Yemen since the 90s until today. And I personally feel very worried and skeptical whenever I hear sudden political declaration on quote unquote peace in Yemen or ending the war on Yemen, because history has shown us that rushed processes, and especially the ones that trickle down from the international level and not domestically driven, have never really worked in Yemen's history. So if we look at the National Dialogue Conference, for example, this is just kind of recent, it was in 2013, and the NDC was a mechanism designed to help Yemen after President Saleh was overthrown. There was this grand disillusionment at that time of the entire process. The young revolutionaries were sold this fairy tale that the future is bright and that the international community will back them up if they formulate just a clear and resolute picture of Yemen and how power should be shared during this transition process. But the reality is that there were some fundamental grievances that were beyond the capacity of the NDC to address. And chief among them were just, basic issues of security, of bread and butter issues, and just the lack of economic stability. And this has fumed discontent, which continued to rise as people saw politicians in the capital in Sana'a just negotiating in five-star hotels over extended buffets while they were sleeping hungry. And I have a personal experience with this because in 2013, I was an external consultant doing a monitoring and evaluation project for USAID for an affected community by terrorism in the south of Yemen in Abiyan, and just found people sustaining themselves by food vouchers. Really, there was no economic opportunity, no other modes of surviving, while being constantly bombarded by NDC messages. Billboards were being built in their remote villages to talk about NDC while they were sleeping hungry every day. So, and the problem is that the politicians were not seeing this. And I fear that the politicians today are also not seeing the warning signs that are there today. They're just so similar to what happened during the NDC. And of course, like the irony is that due to the volatility of the transition, back in 2013, Saleh, who was overthrown, was brought back to the fold. So all of that progress that the revolutionaries were doing, it was undone. Saleh decided to ally with the Houthis and reinstate his power in the country, and it plunged the country into the civil war that it's experiencing till this very day. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we're living in a similar reality today, as I mentioned. Policymakers are interested in stopping the violence, at least momentarily, but not on the long run. So we saw this in the UN negotiated peace talks in Stockholm, which managed to stop conflict in Hodeidah, but absolutely did nothing when non-state actors violently sacked other villages in Hodeidah, when they used Katyusha missiles to attack the tribes of Hajur, when they used drones against the south of Yemen, killing hundreds of people. So simply what happened is that the infamous non-state actor in Yemen, the Houthis, just redeployed all of their men from Hodeidah elsewhere in the country. And it all happened under our very noses. And this is probably the reason why when Yemeni communities hear that the international community is pushing for peace in Yemen, and they're not really jumping with joy. They're just asking what calamity is going to befall them as a result, because there's no bandwidth to understand and intuitively calculate the consequences of, what happens when one party withdraws and another party has arms and is capable of violence on the ground. And I can say that really the international community's principle of do no harm falls absolutely short when it comes to peace processes in Yemen. So yes, there's good momentum and a good push for peace, but there's also a lack of interest in dealing with the core grievances and that are driving the conflict forward. And we have to here focus on the process. This is why the process matters. And how we deal with a negotiated political settlement matters. Is it going to be an elite-driven political process, focused on simply manageable short wins? Or is it going to be one where just narrow focus of interests and political actors are going to be presented as opposed to the society as a whole? Is it going to acknowledge the current underlying grievances? These are really fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves every time that we hear of these grand declarations of, ending the war in Yemen. And this brings me to the core of my talk, because today Yemenis in the north are having a new grievance. It's not just the economic and the security grievances that we know, but they're currently living under the control of a non-state actor, the Houthis, with their human rights, gender rights, children rights, religious freedoms, all threatened. There is no future in Yemen for anyone who is not a Houthi affiliate or a sympathizer. So the Houthis have managed in the past few years to have full control of state institutions, and they've taught us that they don't share power. Otherwise, if they did, they wouldn't have killed Saleh and imprisoned his many party members from the General People's Congress. Yet the international community, I fear that they cannot put this into the calculus of the peacemaking process. And because there's just an overwhelming desire to close the chapter of war and just move on. So I fear that we're hearing the same fairy tales again over, just saying that if Saudi Arabia goes away, then everything will be normal. But what happens then? What happens to the Houthis? Iran, how do we balance everything out? And, these are the questions that I'm not hearing in the international community. And I think one of the problems is that we have a problem in the definition. First, peace for the Houthis means the departure of Saudi Arabia and the complete control of Yemen. But peace for Yemenis, the majority of Yemenis who oppose the Houthis, mean disarming the Houthis and seeking economic support from the neighboring Gulf. There's a look there towards future instability. And these competing visions are really problematic. This is going to be a serious impediment for a resilient peace process. The process of ending the war cannot go without addressing the core issues that could unravel Yemen and have it plunge deeper into chaos. So again, we're at risk of going to square one over and over again with every peace process. And I want to be just absolutely clear. Saudi Arabia bears a huge responsibility for many of the calamities in Yemen. But I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia's role today because there's an international awareness and emphasis on the Saudi role, and the Houthis remain a blind spot in our calculation. So, in fact, getting rid of Saudi Arabia as a player for Yemen might be the easy part, given the fact that they're looking for an exit strategy or looking for an exit. But what I'm concerned about today is the daily lives of Yemeni people, the men, the women, the children who are subjected to the Houthi violence, and which goes completely, uncalculated in peacemaking processes. And although the Houthis seem to say that they want peace, they're really incapable of giving this peace. And there are just several indicators that are just really telling us that all of this talk about peace is just really lip service. So the first one I want to talk about is that a resolution to Yemen's war at this very time is really at odds with the Houthis' military strategy. So we can talk about peace all we want, but we have to understand that battlefield realities and local dynamics in the country are moving at a much, much faster pace than the international peace processes or the regional desire for peace. Houthis are brazenly advancing into Ma'rib, as Greg mentioned, and Ma'rib is one of the most important cities in Yemen and refugees for millions of Houthi opposition in the north. And the Houthi strategy right now is to open multiple battle fronts and this has been the Houthi strategy for the past few years. They open multiple battle fronts in a war of attrition designed to just deplete the government resources and test the Saudi border and defenses. The Houthis were able to expand locally with very little international attentions to the level of violence that they're generating inside. And without really any consequence. And the current rate of expansion for the Houthis is extremely advantageous for them. So if they control Ma'rib, they're at risk to expand further into Shabwa and even to the heart of the south towards the Gulf of Aden. And that will give them an opportunity to control Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is a critical maritime choke point that they've been trying to reach for years. And I think, gaining control of the south might be a bit of a challenge for the Houthis, given the fact that there are, deep animosities between Southerners and Houthis, and also given the fact that there are thousands of Emirati trained troops in the area. Basically, this would be a challenge, but it means that we might see another smaller civil war coming soon because the Houthis are ready to continue fighting and putting their ground troops, because this is just a war of attrition that has very little consequence to their central leadership and command. The second thing, the second indicator that Houthis do not want peace is because an end to the war through a peace process will challenge their absolute control over the country. So as it is, Houthis have complete power. And we know that very well because they're not good in sharing power. They're not good team players. Moreover, there are a number of intended and unintended consequences as well that have, emboldened them and given them leverage. So for example, the Houthis benefited from a change of administration in Washington, which lifted the terrorism designation, which I was, for the record, I was against. But what the Houthis did was they used that to say, hey, well, America has legitimized us. People see us differently because we are the righteous people. We are indigenous, righteous people. Everyone in Yemen is indigenous, but I don't know. This has become just a catchphrase that the international community is using. Also, politically, Houthis are at an amazing position. They continue to engage in a UN process that acknowledges them, respects their presence as an armed state actor, irrespective of whether they abide by international obligations or not. So this is something that they really enjoy. And if in a peace process, they won't have that. So if Houthis now attack Saudi Arabia, they get allowed condemnation from the UN, but also followed by a visit from the UN envoy to patch things up. If Houthis put, Baha'is in jail, they get shamed by European, emissions on Twitter, but then they're visited by some European ambassador later. If Houthis recruit thousands of child soldiers, what you get is a report from, the New York Times on how the Gulf is recruiting mercenaries. So for them, it's a complete win-win in this war. And because most of attention, as I mentioned, is focused on the humanitarian catastrophe created by the Saudi intervention, the Houthis just want the latitude to continue committing the humanitarian abuses against the local population with impunity. This is why peace is not something that would work in their favor. The most of the political privileges that they enjoy today will cease to exist if they share power. And finally, I wanted to talk or touch briefly on the theological aspect. Houthis' theological beliefs stand in the way of an inclusive Yemeni society, and it's a huge barrier for peace. And it's a problem that policymakers at the international level do not even acknowledge. It's important to understand that Houthis' vision for Yemen is deeply, deeply connected to a widely contested belief that only descendant of the Prophet Muhammad can rule Yemen. And this belief is widely rejected in Yemen, and not only because it is discriminatory, but also because it has proven to be the cause of grave injustice and cruelty in Yemen's history. Yemen had a revolution in the 60s just to get rid of that imamate system. And, the Houthis' emphasis on the sectarian aspect as an exclusive right of the Houthi elites, who are known as Ashraf or Sada, and, who share the Prophet's bloodline, has already led to the appointment of many of these Sada in the majority of state institutions and the coercion of millions of people who are living under their control. So, this is problematic because the Houthis would literally spill rivers of blood if that means ensuring that their own bloodline is having the superiority, is superior, that it maintains its superiority. And we've seen this with the recruitment of child soldiers, extermination of villages, etc. So, they'll stop at nothing to ensure that that objective is met. And the peace agreement, which does not acknowledge, does not understand how to address the Houthis' absolute right to govern Yemen, or at least grant them the social status and the political future of the country, will be a difficult proposal for the Houthis to endorse. Honestly, if I was, a Houthi, I would not hurry to accept the peace agreement, because right now they have it all. So I fear, and I'm concluding here, I just want to say that I fear that the big players, the big international players who want to settle Yemen war are unwilling to address the current local challenges because of their complexity. But there's no way around this issue. You have to go through it. The UN Envoy Office, the Biden administration has got to deal or address these issues, start a dialogue on these issues, on how the future of a Yemeni society is going to be. Given the fact that the peace is priority, we have to realize now that there's more potential than ever for Houthis to achieve their long-term goals. So failing to understand this, that, that Houthis are playing the long game, that they are having all of these changes that they've implemented in the society is, going to lead to a really dark and violent future with the establishment of a totalitarian theocratic state. And we really must ensure everything that we can do to stop this from happening and give people the aspirations and the dream and return them to, that moment in the NDC moment where they were so hopeful of a better future for Yemen. So thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you, Fatima. I think that's a great overview of what from Washington can often look like a very simple bifurcated process that as you get closer to the ground is much, much more complicated. Just a quick reminder to everybody who's listening in that please don't wait to the end to put in your questions. You can go ahead and fill those in type those into the question and answer chat function on the bottom of your screen. And then after our next two presenters, we'll have a discussion where we'll be able to field some of your questions and have a more robust discussion and drill down on some of these points. So let me now turn it over to Ibrahim, who I think is going to speak now about what's happening on the ground and prospects for peace.
Let me say thank you, Fatima, for sketching a profound overview of the complex issues in and outside Yemen. The one thing to begin with is just to reaffirm how shallow the international projection of the conflict in Yemen has been. In the next couple of minutes, I want to talk about three things. The renewed diplomatic engagement with the appointment of Timothy Lender King as a special envoy for Yemen, and then go a little bit to shed light about why it matters, the stakes at hand, and how different actors responded to that, given the significance of this battle. It is game-changing in many ways. And then the chances of peace under the current United Nations Special Envoy, everyone's beloved, maybe Martin Griffiths. So let me begin by saying that the appointment of Lender King has been key and timely needed. For the past couple of years, the political trajectory has been abandoned under the Special Envoy. The last time, actually, the warring parties, particularly the government of Yemen and the Houthis, gathered in the setting of peace consultations happened in Sweden. That was back in 2018. In fact, after 2 years of disconnect, when Walda Sheikh Ahmed was an envoy, he had to leave his office for Martin Griffiths. But we entered that gap in terms of timeline. And not only this abandonment happened, but we also have a worsening humanitarian crisis. It will not be resolved unless the consequences that led to this very crisis are resolved. The conflict itself, the politicization and weaponization of aid, the level of complicity at international organizations, humanitarian organizations, I mean here. And then you have the regional level changing landscape. You have the Saudis seeking a way out. It's not a strategy, no strategy for entering the war and no strategy for exiting it, in fact. But that also gave the Houthis more belief that time is playing to their advantage, as opposed to the first thought when the war started. Back when the Arab coalition intervened in 2015, there was the common thought that it would have only taken weeks, 2 months. And even if the war prolonged, given the mismatch of resources and the capability of a coalition backed by the United Kingdom and the United States, it would have been a war of attrition for the Houthis. This has not been the case 5-6 years on. And then we have increasing, Israeli-Iranian tensions. You have exchange of fire, bombings in the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea and elsewhere. And this is, at the regional level, we're seeing more signs of intensification. And then you have Saudi-Iranian tensions and these ideological and very deep, even if yesterday's talk by the Crown Prince suggests otherwise, or try to pave the way for reconciliation. We are far off from a reconciliation that works. We're very far. Let's put that clear. But then you also have inter-GCC reconciliation. The Gulf country of Qatar on the one hand, and then you have Bahrain, the UAE, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as Egypt on the other hand. And this is in some ways good. But the benefits and gains that were made by some actors, for example, Doha, during this crisis, including by deepening its ties with Iran, as well as fostering better ties with the Houthis, are set to continue, because these very changes now are pushing those who are leading the coalition to minimize their engagement, which is the opposite when we talk about Iran. Just over the past 2 weeks, we saw an Iranian Quds Force commander admitting the very profound contribution in arming the Houthis and in sending advisory and mercenaries and technical experts. And for many years, this has been under the table, or because of lack of evidence, people would just simply downplay its importance. So, and then you have a greater interest in de-escalation by Gulf states because they became vulnerable to the very ballistic missiles they were laughing at in 2017. They were like, this is minimal. These are trivial. We should not take this seriously. But eventually the Iranian contribution to the development of Houthi war machine capability proved just different. It went into a Tanura port, which is very strategic for the Saudis and energy supplies. They attacked Saudi civil infrastructure. It just tells you how much at stake has been for the Saudis that was not in 2015 after March, in 2016, 2017 somehow. And then you have the increasing level of Oman. Oman has been a hub for Houthi talks with the West and has been, a gateway to talk with the Europeans, with the Brits, with the Americans. In fact, Linder King, before his appointment, spoke with the Houthis in different capacities and directly and indirectly there. So you have now, with Tim Linder King going back, you have President Biden putting this discourse and the war in Yemen during his State Department speech. Yes, Yemen matters. For his first 100 days, the administration sought to have a political victory to reassure domestic audiences that it is meeting some of the electoral manifesto. But then again, the realities check back against all of these ill-thought, fast-paced movements. Because the first three things that happened when he appointed, he froze the FTO designation, which was not necessarily good, given the humanitarian conditions. It was bad. It wouldn't have meant anything in terms of military distribution of power, and therefore would have inflicted damage on civilians. And then you have appointing Linder King, which is good. While it put Yemen at the fore again, it gave Martin Griffiths one more chance in 2021. Last year, I was hearing people saying, this is the final year for Martin Griffiths in office. And should he fail to deliver deliver tangible results, then we should be preparing ourselves to have another envoy. And then you have the EU and the Germans trying to pave the way for a deeper level of engagement. And this is more evident with Berlin Conference on Yemen, without Yemenis, of course, which is to garner international support for whatever proposal we've been having. And initially, the last year has been focused on the joint declaration. And the joint declaration in some ways resonates with the Saudi ceasefire proposal. A nationwide ceasefire. It doesn't talk about specifically, which is my next talking point. And the opening of Sana'a airport and other easing measures to downplay the level of humanitarian crisis. But then one of the flagging points, according to some leaks, that the Houthis wanted to include Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran within the reopening of Sana'a airport, which is technically not the biggest thing for Yemenis seeking business studies or even medic. And that questions whether they care about the great share of Yemeni population. But then all of these moves and shifts that have been ripening at the regional and global level over the past years have been crushed with the Houthi reaction to the Biden administration is a reversal of the FTO designation. Just within the past 48 hours, the Houthis responded. They launched a large-scale offensive against Ma'rib, which is the largest and the strongest stronghold for the government of Yemen in the northwest. And this offensive has been happening since last year. The Saudis and the coalition announced a ceasefire in April, and the Houthis announced their kind of peace, which Ilana Deloger rightly called as a Houthi wish list back then. And then the joint declaration proposal eventually evolved from the Houthi vision. So Peace Track, which is the organization co-founded by Rasha, did compare the joint declaration, the Houthi vision for peace, and the ceasefire proposal. And it was very much speaking to that. So it was one-sided, which is one reason why it failed. But then with the Houthi offensive now in the 4th month and failing to make a significant breakthrough, given the resilience of the Yemeni armed forces and the tribal resistance in Ma'rib, I think the ceiling of the Houthis is pushing back a little. But that doesn't mean that Ma'rib is safe. In fact, as Michael Knight of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy argues, there is a need to save Ma'rib to save the peace process. And this happens by pushing the Houthis back. And this is the argument a couple of us made last year in March, before we talk about the Ma'rib offensive this year. So once you talk to local researchers and experts, you get a different image of the priorities. A couple of the things we've been saying last year are being said today by foreign experts. If you read, for example, the ICG piece on Ma'rib, to recommend putting pressure on the Houthis, like they put pressure in the case of Hodeidah, which was described then by Martin Griffiths as the center of gravity in the conflict. It was game-changing. It would have cut an artillery supply of so many things for the Houthis then, but that didn't happen thanks to the Stockholm Agreement, which put a lot of pushback against the peace process. It divided it. It created more incentives for the Houthis to expand elsewhere because Hodeidah became bounded by United Nations Security Council resolution, which the government to an extent values because it understands international law. It's engaged. It has an obligation as opposed to non-state actors, which is a point that Fatima made very clearly. And then you have the social importance of Ma'rib. It is the largest hub of those forces opposing not the Houthis necessarily, but the idea of imamate. And imamate is a theocratic system that claims its legitimacy by blood, by being descendant to the Prophet Muhammad. And Prophet Muhammad didn't have sons, in fact. He had daughter, and they claimed that bloodline to his daughter. So imagine today, and I hear this a lot being spoken today, more vocally by a lot in the Yemeni media, that what would have happened if the Prophet had son who survived, and what would have the concept of caliphate be? What would have been the fate of the Muslim Ummah when there has been no political system, at least within the limit of Quran, that says this is the political system you should live with. There is none. There are some practices that evolved through the Sahaba and ways of shura and dialogue among them to select the leaders. So Ma'rib gains credence by being the strongest hub to the Imamate project in Yemen. And Bara Shayban yesterday published something about the clash of the two revolutions in Yemen. The Republican revolution, which Fatima spoke about, and then the Houthi Imamate. Now I call it new Imamate because it's not only the way the Houthi wants, but it's also tied to Iran. And that gives a complex development. And then you have the humanitarian landscape. Ma'rib evolved from a population of less than or around 300,000 people to close to 3 million people. Most of these fled the brutality of militias. They sought another life, and some of them are registered as IDPs, others are not. And according to IOM, Ma'rib is the single largest IDP hub in the country. Local governance there improved, services and gas continue even to Houthi-held areas. And that tells you about the political, economic, social, and peace importance of Ma'rib. The visits of the new relief coordinator, Gregory, as well as the Swedish special envoy should be built on by external actors, by the international community, because Ma'rib is a game changing for the future of Yemen and the region, even if you look at the evolution of the axis of resistance that have the ties that bind with Iran ideologically and in many ways. And then the final point I want to make is regarding, and I will make it very brief, about the prospects of peace under Martin Griffiths. For me, as an analyst, to look at the prospects of sustain, and as a Yemeni, let me put my analytical hat aside. As a young Yemeni, I want a durable peace in Yemen. Let's make that clear. A durable peace that works for the Houthis, that works for all Yemeni tribes, that works for the STC, that works for other southern movements, that works for the Tahamis, that works for everyone. I don't want a peace where the state becomes, weaker than all other competing non-state actors. And therefore, durable peace would not just be in sight, and conflict reoccurrence would be a byproduct of any fragile peace process. And this is exactly where the UN Special Envoy is at right now. Look at the Stockholm Agreement. It's just an example of the accomplishments he made in 2018. And since between 2018 and 2020, there has been no proposal that gained momentum, that made a breakthrough, that corrected some of the mistakes. In fact, Martin Griffiths, despite his tireless effort and travels and etc., he thwarted all the progress made by his predecessors, most notably the Sheikh Ahmed, who made, some brief understandings during Kuwait, not necessarily on all files, but some. And these areas should have been built on. But today, the realities have changed on the ground. And you have more actors. Before 2017, you didn't have the STC. And the STC is backed now by the UAE, to a large extent, politically, economically, security, and militarily. And this is undeniable. And then you have Tariq Saleh, who announced the political office last month. So you see proliferation in the number of actors, which doesn't make the job of the UN envoy easier. In fact, it makes it easier to seek any broader understanding to end, but not resolve the conflict and the root causes of the conflict. Grievances have widened and deepened during the course of the conflict. And it is my fear as a Yemeni analyst or as a Yemeni young person is to see Yemen put far away deliberately or inadvertently by the goodwill of international actors. Back in 2019, I delivered a speech to hundreds of young students and professionals in Kazakhstan, and the title was "The Kind of Peace I Fear in Yemen." That was 2 years-ish ago. And I summed my discussion with a sentence. I would sum it today with this same sentence. It should threaten us as global citizens of the world to see organizations or more stable countries like the UN or liberal countries like the United Kingdom and the US and Sweden or otherwise to end wars by sowing the seeds of the next conflict round. Perhaps by granting a militia winning solution that leaves civilians of conflict-affected countries, such as ours in Yemen, a victim of sectarian cancer, given the very local dynamics that Fatima explained, in conflict trap and with poor governance. And these are the very reasons that lead to violent extremism, proliferation of militias, and their development, and spillover of conflict dynamics beyond Yemen's borders and by Bab el-Mandeb Strait through maritime routes. I think this is the kind of peace I would fear as a Yemeni. Thank you, and I pass it back over.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. That was fascinating and really in depth, and I think will give us a lot of room for the discussion to come. But before that, I want to turn it to Rasha, and she's going to speak about women's peace and the push for feminist peace that her organization has been working on. So, Rasha, over to you.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Fatima and Ibrahim, for laying a great in-depth analysis and bringing the context to this talk. What I wanted to focus on is more into the feminist peace that we have been pushing for. In the Peace Track initiative, since a couple of years now, we've been working with the Yemeni women inside and outside the country, mainly the Women's Solidarity Network, more than 300 Yemeni women. We've been addressing the different topics that are being discussed in the peace agenda in general, but also discussing with women on what should be addressed in the peace agenda. We have positioned ourselves as a feminist peace partner that does not compromise on accountability. meaning that when we came into the space of peace mediation and facilitation, we have noticed that a lot of track 2 partners and track 1 partners basically disregard the violations of human rights to appease the conflict parties, to safeguard the fragile peace process. And we are trying to change this approach that in order to move forward into a peace process in Yemen, this needs to be inclusive, it needs to be accountable, it needs to be transparent with sharing information of what is being discussed with all the Yemeni people. So as you said, there has been a lot of developments, positive developments and peace factors that we have been observing very recently with the Oman mediation process, with the Iraq mediation Iraq-based mediation between KSA, Saudi Arabia and Iran. This all gives positive signs, but at the same time, it seems like, again, it is being designed in a patriarchal way, limiting the peace process into 2-party mediation, and instead of having multi-party and having those who are affected by the conflict, including the Yemenis themselves, be present in the peace process. You have also mentioned, Greg, in the opening about lifting the designation of the Houthis from the terrorist group. This one, we were discussing with the women about this issue, and it was one of the things that we had mixed reactions about, but definitely lifting the designation and the way it was done had consequences in terms of escalating the conflict. This is what we heard from the woman in Marib, who said that the moment those announcements happened, vicious attacks escalated and targeting displacement areas and issues like this. But we need to see this, and the Houthis need to see this as this is the last time or last chance for them to really engage positively in the peace process. This was given to them so that they will be able to engage diplomatically in a peace process, and they should see this as a chance. The international community will not accept to have a non-state actor that is now the largest non-state armed weaponized group that have cross-border capabilities. If we had in our neighbors, if they were European countries or Western countries, we will have a different reaction to the Houthis comparing to when it is that in the case is Saudi Arabia. What we noticed is that the international community is looking for a quick fix in Yemen. They're oversimplifying the conflict. They're looking, if we look into the peace consultations that happened about Yemen since Kuwait in 2016 till Stockholm and what came after as well, most of those peace consultation stations focused on really confidence building measures rather than really the contesting issues that we need to discuss. I think that only Kuwait maybe discussed some major issues which included disarmament and releasing the detainees and reinstituting or reclaiming the state institutions. But after that, everything was focusing on confidence building measures topics that were humanitarian, that were mostly opening corridors, opening airport, releasing detainees, and all coming from humanitarian perspective. This led to the politicalization of such topics, and this is why we did not see any implementation of the peace agreements that have been discussed. The major contested issues that have been ignored in the peace table include for example, the South question, the shape of the state, the governance system, the service delivery. All of these issues are the things that are contested and that are going to have an impact in the lives of people, have not been discussed yet in the peace agenda. Why I'm saying this, it's because the mediators try to pick quick fixes and quick solutions to achieve quick wins, but at the same time led to the complication of these issues that were supposed to be something that goes on unconditionally, smoothly, without any conditions and without any negotiations. Who would oppose opening a road for having access of humanitarian issues? But because they became political, everything became complicated. The ceasefire initiative that we have seen recently that focused on the ceasefire arrangements, humanitarian issues and economic issues, and also resumption of the talks, we noticed that also it's first of all, the design is always a two-state actor design. It's not what we have been promoting is a multi-party inclusive process. There's many actors, as my colleagues mentioned, that needs to be in the process, but not only the armed groups, de facto groups that exist, but also the civil society, women, tribal leaders, community leaders, and those who are affected communities especially need to be in the peace process. One of the topics also mentioned in the ceasefire was the salaries issue. Mentioning the salaries issue is something that has been a problem for Yemen for a couple of years now. People, civil servants, and even military servants are not able to access their salaries, or they are interrupted, or they're not paid in full. For example, in Stockholm Agreement, one of the aspects was actually that the revenues from the Hodeidah port is going to be deposited to the bank of Central Bank of Hodeidah, must be used for salaries disbursement. Instead, it was diverted by the Houthis, and there was no accountability. So this is something else. When we say something is going to happen through a peace agreement, we don't have mechanisms for implementation or for monitoring or for sanctions and accountability. We should, when there is a party who breaches an agreement, we need to have an established system for accountability for breaching those agreements. So setting these precedents and actually not doing anything about it, and even with the assassination of the government official in Hodeidah, who was part of the observation of the Hodeidah implementation, there was no investigation about his killing. And again, what we have been focusing on and promoting is actually to have at least self-imposed sanctions, that each party need to have a list of self-imposed sanctions. When something happens like this, they can take the lead in disciplining their own parties who are basically not adhering to the agreements. So one more thing that I wanted to add is basically that the ceasefire agreement and the negotiation of the peace agreements also had missed opportunities in employing a human rights-based approach. For example, and this is what I said about the accountable part, there were many missed opportunities in the joint declaration. There was no mention to the sexual and gender-based violence, for example, and we have seen in the group of eminent expert report and the sanction reports, as a panel of sanction reports, that these violations exist, and they are existing against women, against children, against men, against all groups in Yemen, including women human rights defenders and politicians. So this was not mentioned in any draft that I have seen. Child recruitment, which is one of the major topics in 2216, resolution 2216, which is the guiding reference document, has completely dropped out of the peace agenda list. And in the peace agreement, again, it's not mentioned at all that we need to stop child recruitment. Issues of, for example, creating proxy armed groups or new armed groups, it's not mentioned as a prohibited act. These things need, because this is what we have seen. We have seen anyone who has a little bit of money can create an armed group and basically take what they and control what they want. Another thing is the formation of or another call that we have been always calling for was actually the removal of camps and military depots from the cities, because it is Yemen is designed in a way that these military locations are hosted in highly populated areas. And so this has been a call that we have always repeatedly asked for, and which actually was integrated into the Riyadh agreement as a result of our advocacy, but we are not seeing yet the implementation of this. So we are proposing that this should be self-imposed. If a party is controlling their area, then they should take the lead on moving those military depots and military camps to outside or to the outskirts of the city, to remote areas that are not populated. So to end, I have a few recommendations. One is basically to localize the peace process and to support local mediation and deconstruct the conflict in Yemen, because the conflict dynamics differ, the conflict parties differ from area to another. And we should have parallel tracks of these peace mediation processes happening together at the same time. We should look into a multi-party inclusive design where not only the government and the Houthis are involved. And this is something we have seen, that the government is always promoting a two-party negotiation, because they want to show that they are a state against a coup party. And the Houthis are happy with this situation as well, because this gives them weight and legitimacy and credibility internationally. This needs to change. It still needs to happen, but it should not be the main negotiation for a peace. When we say nationwide ceasefire, it needs to include all the parties to really achieve a nationwide ceasefire. The last thing is basically there should be a resumption of the peace talks that is not necessarily conditional to the ceasefire process. What we have seen is that there was too many efforts to implement the ceasefire before the resumption of the peace, and it feels like it is a condition for the resumption of the peace negotiations or talks. We are trying to push that it happens in parallel. The negotiations for ceasefire still needs to continue, but at the same time, the parties need to start meeting and to discuss how to end the war and reach a sustainable solution. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to address more in the question in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rasha, and thanks to all three of you for, I think, excellent overviews. And we're going to take about the next 30 minutes and drill down and dig into some of the complexities that I think were brilliantly laid out here this morning. While we do that, I would encourage everyone who's listening in, if you have a question, to again put that into the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. But let me start with this, and this is directed to all three of you, because in one way or another, all three of you address this issue. Fatima, you talked about the fact that the Houthis will do certain things. They will throw the Baha'is in prison. They will not adhere to their agreements. They will do all of these things that violate different things that they've agreed to, either with UN Special Envoy or that they publicly pledged to do, and that there are no repercussions for the Houthis. That they do these things, the UN Special Envoy just goes to Sana'a and tries to patch over the difference, and there is nothing that the international community has been able to do so far that holds them to account. Rasha, you said something very similar with regards to the proceeds in Hudaydah. That is, that these were supposed to be going to pay salaries. The Houthis diverted these payments and used them for their war effort. And Ibrahim, I think you touched on this as well. So my question is, and this seems to be in many ways, the real problem that the international community and the Biden administration has in Yemen. That is, the U.S. quite clearly has leverage with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia, who are military and security partners of the United States. But the U.S. does not seem to have any leverage with the Houthis whatsoever. And this has made creating any sort of peace talks, any sort of negotiations very, very difficult. The steps that the UN has taken, such as sanctions on Abdul Malik and 3 other Houthis, one of whom has since passed away, do not seem to have any impact either. So my question to all 3 of you, and we'll start with Fatima and then go to Ibrahim and then to Rasha, is one, how does the international community, the UN, the US, the EU, create any sort of leverage with the Houthis to essentially compel them to sit down and to negotiate in good faith? And how does the UN and the international community hold the Houthis to account when the Houthis violate what it is that they've agreed to? So it's sort of a 2-part question. Fatima, we'll go to you first.
Thanks, Greg. So it's an important question, and there is no easy answer for this. But we can see several things. There are several positive things that the U.S. can do. For example, yes, the Biden administration lifted the designation, but they also designated a couple of Houthi leaders as terrorist financiers. And, going into details, just saying that we are watching what you're doing. And, we may not, this is not very clear, but the Houthis actually do care about their international image. They care about how they are presented. And they have this dual narrative of, we hate America, we hate the West, and, death to America and all of that, which they use to mobilize their people. But when it comes to the West, they will happily shake hands and, show the other side in order to get as many, concessions from the West as they can. And what I'm asking for here is just a bit more of intelligence in dealing with this group. Let's not just be happy with the first concession or the first thing that they give us. And I think, I was extremely shocked when I first met Martin Griffiths, the UN envoy for Yemen. And when he first talked to us, as a group of Yemeni women who were interested in the peace process in Yemen, he was talking about the importance of addressing important issues like child soldiers, like the mines in Yemen that are implanted by the Houthis, the importance of trying to find a resolution for these issues that are threatening people every day, the detainees. And bit by bit, these issues fell to the bottom of his list. Does he talk about child soldiers? No. Why? Because he wants to preserve, this trust and relationship that he has built with the Houthis over the past 2 years. And this comes on the account, it comes on account of the families who are having these kids, just sent to the battlefield for nothing, just as fodder for this war. So I think the international community is really falling short. It has potential to pressure the Houthis. You can pressure the Houthis not just by pressuring the Houthis directly, but also by pressuring Iran. There's Vienna. Iran wants the sanctions to be lifted. And if you've noticed, the Iranian when the Saudi initiative came, when the Biden administration said that they wanted to support peace in Yemen, Saudis had their peace initiative. The Iranian ambassador to Sana'a, who's really not a legitimate ambassador and only recognized by the Houthis, said it's not really in the Houthis' best interest to accept any peace proposal at the moment. Just let Saudi Arabia leave first. And that so Iran talks about Saudi Arabia's meddling while they're meddling themselves and, financing the Houthis and arming them and helping them strategically. So it's a bit of a mess, but the Biden administration can, look into pressuring Iran as well. Iran is leaving Yemen as one of the cards in its bag, and this needs to change. Finally, I want to say, international pressure, media pressure, that comes from also some policy awareness. And I would love to see people in humanitarian organizations speak about the human rights violations that are happening in Yemen. It's just not happening. there's somewhat a trade-off between the humanitarian situation and the human rights situation. This should stop. And both of them are extremely important. Please focus on both of them. People need to live better, but also, try to understand the sensitivities on the ground of the Houthis really, militarization effort. The Houthis are really not, they all of the state institutions are now under Houthis' hand. All of the state coffers are now redirected to the war effort, not just salaries of people, but revenues from extractive industries or from telecommunication companies. Everything in the country is now directed to the Houthis, which goes to the war effort. There is no way that we can sustain or think about peace with this very uneven dynamic. So yes, the Houthis have monopoly of violence in Sana'a, but we can come to pressure them, bit by bit through media campaigns. I know that there are people from the BBC and the Guardian and, the Washington Post probably tuned into our conversation. And I would just urge them, just as much as they put pressure, they managed to put a successful pressure campaign against Saudi Arabia that actually made this powerful country think about an exit strategy. Can we please make a powerful campaign as well that talks about the violations of the Houthi militia and the role of Iran in it? I'm really tired of, academics and policymakers saying, oh, well, we're not really sure if there's any links, or there are tons of weapons that are being smuggled. Officials are talking about it publicly. The interest of, Yemen is becoming more and more of a hub for Shia militia rather than the Yemeni country that we knew. So I think more awareness is really needed to change, and that could be the leverage that we're looking for.
Thanks, Fatima. And I think those are great points. In particular, I want to come back to the one on the humanitarian situation and what humanitarian organizations can do a little bit later in our chat. But Ibrahim, let's turn to you. What can the international community do to create leverage with the Houthis?
That's one of the questions we always ask ourselves as researchers and analysts. So let me put that clear. And oftentimes we don't have answers, because right now, the United States specifically gave its leverage at no return for free. So at one point had leverage, suddenly that was gone. But I think the United States, the United Kingdom, and European powers can create leverage. And I can think of 3 ways now. One is to dismantle the chain of arms influx into the country, because they continue despite the documentation being maintained by the UN panel of experts since 2018, maybe even more, or even the documentation and evidence held by the Yemeni government since before the Houthi coup d'etat back in the years after the Arab uprising. So you had Jihan case, you had the detention of IRGC members, and that's one way. And I think there has been that article also written by Catherine Zimmerman and Bradley Bowman, and they put that very clear and loud. And they should read this article titled "Bidens Can Bring Peace to Yemen While Iran Keeps Sending Weapons." And they also can go and check some article I wrote with Mustafa Naji about building peace by resurrecting arms. You can't have peace while arms continue to militias. That's one. And I think the United States in specific has played a role in intercepting huge shipments on the coast of Yemen. And it can continue to do so by having political will, first of all, at the level of defense ministry and intel, and to continue that from the Saudi border to the west coast, going down to the Gulf of Aden. And European powers and the international coalition present there can contribute. And there has been a case of Safinas, a ship docked off the Arabian Sea that has been, a telecommunication hub for Iran to assist the Houthis. I think there is an area to reduce such presence there, to kind of reduce this level of interference and exploitation of the country on that front. That's one. Second, you have also documented by the UN panel of experts, and that's the chain of fuel supply. And I think if you go into the names of who owns what in specific, trust me, there's a huge ton of wealth that accumulated in the country being held by militias, but they cannot take it outside the country. And taking out these accumulating wealth needs some external cooperation of powers. Whether regional neighbors who have facilitated the entry of arms and have been very documented by name in the latest panel of expert report, or those who, to the UN envoy, we can't put them on targeted sanctions because we talk to them at the end of the day. And that balance brought by Rasha about accountability and human rights, as well as the pursuit of a noble approach to these things matter. And the fuel issue can be a gateway to creating leverage. It has been tapped on yet, but if you go through the names, you definitely have important names and they matter to the faction. That's second. And third, and I would think it's important for the international community combined. It doesn't exist as a monolithic entity. It exists as, as you can see with the GCPO, the US somewhere, and then European powers somewhere, and they have different interests. And because of these different interests, they have different approaches on Yemen, because they deal with the Houthis as, in some ways, either a strategic partner or a proxy of Iran. But the latest evidence of air lobbying in the country suggests the little level of autonomy. It's increasingly indisputable in that sense, and the merit battle. They can do this. They can not fail to condone to anything, the Houthis say, we will do this, because it is increasingly evident that the international community, whether humanitarian organizations or foreign diplomatic missions or politicians in the progressive, and either overlook things being done, as Fatima mentioned, or simply tell you, well, they're militias and therefore we do not expect a change in behavior. And that backfires every day in the lives of Yemenis, the lives of us, our relatives, and our population inside the country. It reflects every single day on them. This is the very definition of complicity, double standards, and maybe political hypocrisy, if one might be a little bit open and honest. And let me sum all of these things that I said. Any envoy who would work on Yemen must learn from Linder King. He is honest, transparent, and know what he's doing. Once he said, the Houthi, I will get back for a third visit to the region when the Houthis are prepared, after having that discussion on a ceasefire, humanitarian measures, opening of airport. He came back and Erdogan responded, this is not in the interest of the Houthis, don't accept it. And then you saw Mehr News affirming this message, that the Battle of Mehr is important, not only in Yemen, but for talks in Vienna. And Linder King went and testified to the House Affairs Committee. And he was like, the biggest threat to peace process in Yemen is the Houthi attack. That's one. The second is he made clear that they have no incentive right now, somehow, some way, but he put that message clear, that the state secretary tweeted something over the past few days, we must ask ourselves, etc., etc. And that honesty is important to narrow down the gap of expectations, perception, positions, and needs of local, regional, and global stakeholders. That matters. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ibrahim. And Rasha, we'll go to you. And then after, we'll just take a few groups of questions. So after this, we'll talk about the future of the Yemeni state, what that looks like, as well as the Modab offensive, talk about the UN peace process, the role of women, and then the humanitarian situation. So I think we'll group them in that. So Rasha, I'll turn to you. How do you get accountability for the Houthis? How does the international community create leverage to compel them to sit down and negotiate in good faith?
Yes, thank you, Greg. So from our perspective, and I want to emphasize the importance of having sanctions related to child recruitment and sexual and gender-based violence. Working on this field specifically, it was not easy, especially sexual and gender-based violence. It was not easy to report on this because in Yemen there is so much social stigma, and it took a lot of bravery for the women to come forward and to talk about what happened to them in Houthi prisons, and then to have those crimes listed as sanctions, and then to name perpetrators and add them to the list. Yes, the person died, but naming him into the sanction had a big role and gave a sense of justice and accountability to the women who were affected. So we should support these efforts, and we should try to then transfer those sanctions into the International Criminal Court, and refer this case, specifically sexual and gender-based violence and child recruitment, to the International Criminal Court. Shaming and naming for the Houthis work. They are very stressed. They are very worried about how they are perceived internationally. They always want to have a good image and to have credibility internationally, and to show that they are a key state player, not a non-state player, but a key state player. Even in their own vision, they put the negotiating parties in their in their own end of war draft, that them as an actor, and then Saudi Arabia or the coalition as the second actor. They completely disregarded the government as an actor. So they put themselves head to head with Saudi Arabia. And this facilitation of Oman mediation is basically also giving them this continued image that they what they wanted, basically. Another thing is in terms of the as Ibrahim mentioned, the arms transfer, the licit and illicit arms transfer into Yemen. Yemen was already a very militarized nation. It is very, like, we have now 6 years of the war, 6 years of an embargo imposed on the country to control the flow of arms, and we are still seeing the flow of arms happening. So we need to put more pressure on stopping the arms transfers and to the country, and to have more control over this. The other thing also, we need, if we are against, as human rights defenders, we're always against collective sanctions. So naming the Houthis as an entity, it's not advisable, but naming individuals and naming institutions need to happen. And when I say institutions, and you have heard Lisa Grande's testimony about creating the parallel systems, about creating the structures by the Houthis, those structures need to be now targeted by sanctions. We have, if you go to the UN, you would see actually a list of companies that are, that they are Houthi companies, that they are taking customs, processing customs, and in my opinion, the UN and international community humanitarian work became more of the main sponsors for the Houthis, because they caved into their demands in order to process humanitarian interventions in Yemen. And I will add more maybe later during the other questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Rasha. So let's turn, what I'm going to do, there's been several great questions that have come in through the Q&A. So I'm going to group some of those together and then just ask the three of you to keep your responses as brief as possible to give us the full depth, but so we can get through all of the different categories. So let me start. This is for Fatima and Ibrahim, and then Rasha, I'll give you one, and then I'll turn it over to Fatima. So first, on the future of the state, Fatima, you mentioned that the Houthis have received an ambassador from Iran. The Houthis sent an ambassador to Iran. The Houthis, you talked about this as did Rasha, about the Houthis are increasingly acting like a state. They're taking over the government apparatus there in the north. One of the questions that's come in over the chat also refers to the STC. It appears that the Houthis are increasingly acting as a state. The STC wants to be an independent state in South Yemen. Is the idea that the US and the UN are pushing for, that Yemen can be reconstituted as a single state, does that have any bearing in reality? Is that something that's at all possible? Or are we at the situation where Yemen is going to be 2 states, or possibly even 3 states, or 4 or 5, or just a fractured, broken place? What are we looking at when we look at the future of Yemen? And then Ibrahim, this is for you, touching on that same issue that we just spoke about the future of the state. What does that future look like if Marib falls to the Houthis? If the Houthis are able to push those IDPs into Shabwa, into Hadramaut, into other places in the south, which of course will have a domino effect on already an overtaxed infrastructure. If the Houthis, they have a port now in Hudaydah, if they're able to take the oil and gas fields in Marib and use that as some sort of an economic base, do the Houthis have any initiative, any motivation to sit down and negotiate in good faith with the UN Special Envoy, with the US Special Envoy? So what's happening there if Marib does fall? And then Rasha, one of the questions that we've had in the chat is for you. Has the UN participation, has that made has the UN process, the UN peace process, made women's participation more difficult? And then a related question is, what can the United States, the international community, the US, the UN do to encourage and make sure that women's voices are heard? I think you touched on some of this in your talk, but if you wanted to expand a little bit. So I'll start with Fatima, we'll go to Ibrahim and then Rasha, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more broadly about the UN peace process as well as about the humanitarian situation and group some questions in there. And I'll just remind you, we have about 10 minutes left. So if you can be as brief, not telegraphic, but as brief as possible, that would help us get through all of them. So Fatima, we have great trust in your skills.
Thank you, Greg. So, this is not a very popular opinion, the one that I will present now, but it's one that I stood by since, 2015. I had a talk in Harvard, and I said the future doesn't look good in Yemen due to the regional intervention and due to deep grievances that are beyond our capacity to solve at the moment. So I can anticipate Yemen's fragmentation into how many states, God knows. God knows. But in 2015, I made an assertion that it might be 3 states, and the reason why is, the Houthis are now in complete control of the north, and you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. You cannot have any negotiated peace process without them being part of it. But there's also no trust between the Houthis and the other political parties on the ground. I know things shift really quickly in Yemen, and you can see alliances being forged, that are somewhat inexplicable, like the alliance of Saleh and Houthi. But the situation today is different given the tremendous violations that are happening on the ground. And I think it sets it just, with Houthis' incursions on Ma'rib. What do Houthi wants from Ma'rib? They really don't have popularity in Ma'rib. They have nothing in Ma'rib that they want, but to continue expand. But what they really want is to have some type of leverage during any peace process and any peace mediation. I think they want to, and the problem here also, like there's a problem when we talk about the STC. The STC is somewhat exclusionist. They just want the south for themselves, but the Houthis are expansionist. They want entire Yemen, and that means that we're gonna have conflicts in Yemen to come. Civil wars are just gonna probably erupt within. So I'm really concerned. We need to find, and I just hope that my fellow Yemenis will find it within themselves to come together and try to mediate this from the local level, have a locally driven process and not an internationally driven process, and find a way to actually negotiate with the Houthis and with the STC. Because if you can't, nobody's going to come and solve the problem for you. That's the big issue here, is that no one has the capacity to do that but Yemenis themselves. I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Very good at being brief. Ibrahim, we'll turn to you. Is the fall of Marib, does that end the future of Yemen as a single state?
If Ma'rib were to fall, it would be a de facto separation somehow. But given the Houthi expansionist agenda, which has been a consistent pattern since 2004, from Maran and Sa'da to the capture of Jawf and then Amman in 2014, and then Sana'a, and then immediately after the peace and partnership agreement, they went all over. Shabwa is next, and Ma'rib is the shield of Shabwa. And the rules of geography cannot be separated, because in Ma'rib you have two important facilities. One, the Safir Ras Isa oil pipeline, which is in Hudaydah and connects Ma'rib. And then the other is Safir and Bilhaf facility, the gas price. So the chances of going to Shabwa is just really the next target and the next logical thing for the Houthis to do. And what would that mean is an increase in complexion, because you would have more resources, and given the violent-based ideology and the territorial ambitions, the likelihood of expanding elsewhere are just high. And for those who understand the fine line between peace and conflict processes, I don't think the Houthis would have to engage in peace processes unless they want just to take the international legitimacy somehow. But they wouldn't need it for the purpose of operating in any way, because the North would all fall for them, and the South would be just more receptive to them, to the volatility in Ma'rib. And you would see them in Shabwa, most likely Hadramaut. And that's maybe a dynamic where people will be reassessing their choices. Leave it there.
Thank you, Ibrahim. It looks like this will probably be our final question. We won't be able to get to the humanitarian situation or sort of the broader UN process, which is probably just indicative of how incredibly complex the situation in Yemen is on the ground and how many different facets of this problem need to be taken into account. But Rasha, I'm going to give you the last word on these two aspects of the question. And I know this is something near and dear to your heart. Has the UN made women's participation more difficult? And sort of the flip side of that question, what can the UN, the US, the EU, and other international actors do to sort of institutionalize and encourage women's participation in the peace process? You have about 2 or 3 minutes if you want.
All right, thank you. It's not about difficult, but it's more about the quality of participation. Meaning, to me, the mechanisms they have introduced does not reflect meaningful participation for women. Whether it is the Women Technical Advisory Group or basically the models. Let's look at the different tracks. The first track, we had very limited participation. Only one woman participated in the delegation. While I remember in Stockholm, Martin Griffiths went back to Yemen and brought the Houthis with their double numbers. They were all men, 24, double their delegation number, and they were not able to add more women. This was very disappointing at the time. And they tried to remedy this through inviting the Women Technical Advisory Group, but the Women Technical Advisory Group is symbolic participation. It's on the sidelines. They were not allowed to be in the space, whether the opening ceremony or the closing ceremony, or even did not have any formal face-to-face meetings with the conflict parties or the negotiating parties who participated in Stockholm. We decided as Peace Track Initiative that we're going to claim this space and we're going to be sending our own delegations. And the first time we did that was actually in Geneva. We sent a 4-woman delegation. But as you know, in Geneva, that consultation collapsed because the Houthis did not make it. And then in Riyadh as well, we were able to send last-minute delegation. And the participation of women in the Riyadh agreement was actually had like 16 women in the opening, in the signing ceremony. It was symbolic. It's not like they have signed or like as witnesses in the agreement. but at least they were present. And for us, generally, the Riyadh Agreement resonated with a lot of our recommendations. At least 10 articles resonated with our recommendations, including removal of the military depots, combating corruption, the salaries issue. A lot of the things were actually resonating with some of the recommendations that we were sharing with all the parties who were negotiating at the time. Similarly, so we tried to influence the peace process by claiming the space and by sending out our analysis and by sharing information. We noticed that when we share our information publicly, it's taken more seriously than when we share it privately. This is a lesson learned, but at the same time, it's there is a give and take in this in the diplomatic world, and it's not. It was very surprising for me, the pushback against women to be in that space, even by the parties themselves, who were pushing back, and they were entertained, or their excuses were entertained by a patriarchal peace design. For the international community and the US, they can do a lot. First, they can engage with women as a component of the community. We cannot reach a solution, a full or complete solution, when we do not engage with half of the population, or who represent half of the population. We're never going to reach a peace that is meeting the aspirations of all the Yemeni people. So engaging with women, respecting their opinion and seeking their advice. We're launching very soon the Feminist Peace Roadmap that we've been working since a few years now with women groups and feminist men to reflect. And we are going to launch it. It's going to be a guide basically for all the mediators and for the national parties to know what is our minimum standard, let's say, or the least that they can meet in a peace agreement. And the US envoy has started a good start, basically by arranging meetings with civil society organizations. We were able to meet with him last week. And so this kind of engagement is very important, but it needs to be systematic. Not only symbolic meetings, courtesy meetings. No, they need to be systematic and basically taking the feedback and really absorbing what we are saying and hearing us. And I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I have pages and pages of notes. I have a lot of questions that we didn't get to. Thank you to everyone who attended here today. I know for many of you who didn't get your questions answered, all three, Fatima, Ibrahim, and Rasha, write quite frequently on Yemen. I learn a lot from their writings. I think you'll find the answers to many of your questions in what it is that they produce on a pretty regular basis. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Raymond, who will close us out here.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you so much for our speakers for taking the time to be with us and to share the valuable insights. As Greg said, there's so much valuable content in today's presentations that we need to take the time again and come back to some of the questions that we weren't able to address in future programs, especially questions around the humanitarian angle. So we look forward to future engagements around this topic. We're really delighted that we were able to contribute to this important conversation, and we'll continue doing so through future programs and publications. Please feel free to reach out to us with any feedback and questions. We have more webinar planned in the coming weeks, so please make sure to visit our website, agsw.org, sign up to our weekly newsletter to get regular analysis and updates from us. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to having you in future programs with us.